The tunnel was 60 centimeters wide and 75 centimeters high. Those are the measurements of a kitchen cabinet, of a garden gate, of a space the human body can enter with effort, but cannot easily reverse through and cannot stand up in and cannot, if something goes wrong, escape from quickly. The Viet Cong built their tunnel systems to those dimensions deliberately. They had studied the bodies of their enemies and designed the underground accordingly. When American forces found a tunnel entrance in the jungles of South Vietnam, their standard response was to pour tear gas down the hole, toss in grenades, and seal the opening with explosives. It was doctrine, and it was rational, and it found nothing. In January of 1966, 40 Australian engineers looked at the same kind of hole in the ground and sent a man down. Tell me in the comments, have you ever heard of the Australian tunnel rats before today? Because what you are about to discover will change how you understand both the Vietnam War and the soldiers who fought it. Now let's go. The surface of Cu Chi district looked like any other stretch of South Vietnamese countryside in the early 1960s. Flat agricultural land interrupted by jungle, paddy fields edging toward tree lines, red laterite soil baking hard in the dry season and turning to rust-colored mud in the wet. Nothing on the surface suggested what was beneath it. Nothing was designed to. Construction of the first tunnels began during the Japanese occupation of Vietnam, in the years after 1942. When the French colonial war resumed after the Second World War, the Viet Minh expanded these passages as escape routes and weapons caches, building them in the clay-heavy soil that would, when it dried, set to a consistency that bordered on cement. Local people dug mostly in the monsoon season when the ground was soft and left the tunnels to harden as the dry months returned. The resulting material was extraordinarily resistant to compression and blast. The French bombed these areas repeatedly. The tunnels survived. By the time American military power arrived in South Vietnam in the early 1960s, the tunnel system in the Cu Chi region had been evolving for nearly 20 years. The Viet Cong's response to an enemy whose advantage resided entirely in what could be seen and struck from the air was not improvised and not hurried. They organized their entire military existence around becoming invisible beneath the ground those aircraft were firing from. And they had been doing it since before most of the American soldiers now arriving had finished primary school. The system grew to more than 200 kilometers in total length, stretching from the outskirts of Saigon to the Cambodian border. It ran on 3 levels. The uppermost, 3 meters below the surface, contained the spaces of daily life. Cooking areas using specially designed stoves, whose smoke was channeled through concealed vents to emerge far from any entrance. Meeting rooms, sleeping quarters, underground classrooms. The second level, 5 to 6 meters down, served as the system's circulatory architecture. The movement corridors, the hiding points, the ambush positions built at tunnel junctions with crossfire lines designed to destroy anyone who entered from the wrong direction. The third level, 8 to 12 meters underground, housed what could not be reached by conventional bombardment. Field hospitals with rudimentary but functional surgical equipment, command rooms, weapons workshops, food and ammunition stores connected by passage to the Saigon River's underwater banks, allowing resupply without any surface movement whatsoever. Connecting these 3 levels were the tunnels that gave the system its name and its military logic. They were 60 to 80 centimeters wide. They were 75 to 120 centimeters high. They had been dug to the physiological specifications of the Vietnamese fighter, whose average height was approximately 160 centimeters. The passages were not merely small. They were a weapons system. They were designed to be impassable to larger bodies and to channel any intruder who managed to enter into a sequence of dead ends booby traps, and prepared ambush positions where defenders who knew every turn of the system from memory could wait in total darkness for the sound of someone approaching who did not. Alongside those defenders lived something the phrase tunnel warfare does not adequately convey. Venomous centipedes, scorpions, snakes, bats. The passages were permanently hot, permanently humid, and never fully ventilated. Captured Viet Cong. Reports from the period state that at any given moment, up to half of any unit living underground had malaria, and that 100% of soldiers spending extended time in the tunnels carried intestinal parasites of clinical significance. Malaria was the second largest cause of death in the tunnel system after combat wounds. Survivors who sheltered in the Su Chai system during Allied operations in 1966 later described the experience of lying underground while the Allied artillery bombardment walked across the surface above them. They gave those bombardments a name. They called them the New Zealand Dong Dun Orchestra. The name was ironic and precise. These were not desperate people who had retreated underground from lack of other options. They were methodical people who had decided that the underground was where the war could be won, and who had organized their entire military existence around that decision. For the Allied forces who found it, the underground posed not a tactical question in the ordinary sense. It was a physiological and psychological question. Can your soldiers fit inside this space? And if they can fit, are they willing to go in? In November of 1964, the Australian government of Robert Menzies introduced the National Service Scheme. A ballot barrel in a public ceremony determined which birthdays would be called. Numbered marbles drawn twice a year, each number corresponding to a birth date. The result announced, and the men it named required to serve 2 years in the Australian Army, followed by 3.5 years in the reserve. Over the life of the scheme, more than 800,000 Australian men registered. 63,000 were called up. Approximately 18,000 would eventually serve in South Vietnam. The decision to send Australian forces to that war was not primarily a military calculation. It was an alliance calculation. The Menzies government had watched the United States escalate its commitment to South Vietnam through the early years of the decade, assessed the threat that a communist consolidation of Southeast Asia posed to Australian strategic interests, and concluded that the security of the country was best served by demonstrating to Washington that the alliance was a reciprocal arrangement. Prime Minister Harold Holt would express this in its most direct formulation when he pledged in Washington in June of 1966 that Australia would go all the way with LBJ. The phrase was tactically ill-advised as diplomacy. As a summary of the political arithmetic behind the commitment, it was accurate. The 1st Australian Ground Combat Unit deployed to South Vietnam was the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, which arrived at Bien Hoa in June of 1965. The battalion group that deployed numbered approximately 1,400 men, with an artillery battery of the Royal Australian Artillery and an engineering element from the Royal Australian Engineers. That engineering element was No. 3 Field Troop, 1st Field Squadron. Approximately 40 men, whose equipment included earth-moving machinery, demolition stores, bridging materials, and the standard tools of military engineering that had changed relatively little since the First World War. Their expected role was road clearing, mine sweeping, bridge construction, and the destruction of enemy facilities found by the infantry. Their motto, Facimus et Frangimus, we make and we break, covered the full scope of what military engineers do when armies go to war. It did not anticipate a third category of work. It could not have. The third category of work did not yet exist as a recognized military discipline. The question that defined everything that followed was asked by a young captain named Alexander Hugh MacGregor, and it was not asked dramatically. It was asked practically, with the directness of an engineer confronting an unfamiliar technical problem. In October of 1965, months before any large operation had been planned in the Hobo Woods, 3 field troop encountered their first Viet Cong tunnel entrance during a patrol east of Saigon. A single Viet Cong soldier at that entrance fired from inside the tunnel, killing 2 Australians and wounding 2 more before disappearing back underground. The tunnel swallowed him. Nobody followed. The entrance was examined, found to lead somewhere, and logged. MacGregor looked at it after the contact had ended and asked the question that would name an entire category of warfare. Does anybody know what is down there? Nobody did. He and his men decided, at that first encounter, that the next time they found an entrance, somebody was going in after him. He was a graduate of the Royal Military College, Duntroon, at which the nation's professional officers are shaped in the particular mold of institutionalized competence and physical endurance that marks career soldiers everywhere. He was a young captain, commanding approximately 40 men, and he had served long enough to understand the difference between a question that deserved to be asked and one that should be left alone. To understand what his decision meant, it helps to understand what kind of men he was asking to carry it out. 3 Field Troop was not the kind of unit that handled serious work with solemnity. They ran a private casino in their off-duty hours, funded by their own labor. When newly arrived officers attempted to commandeer the shower block the Sappers had built with casino profits, the Sappers booby-trapped it and waited to see what happened. During a military police chase through Saigon that at its peak involved simultaneous pursuit by American, Australian, and South Vietnamese MPs, 2 sappers commandeered a civilian tuk-tuk and drove it under the barrier gate of their own camp at speed. The specific breed of controlled, irrepressible irreverence that runs through Australian military culture, men who took the work completely seriously and took almost nothing else seriously at all, ran at full strength through 3 Field Troop. The word sapper carries a history that matters here. A sapper originally meant one who dug a sap, a narrow approach trench used to undermine fortifications. Since gunpowder, military engineers had been tunneling beneath castle walls and enemy ramparts and blowing them up from below. Australian engineers had done this on an almost incomprehensible scale at the Battle of Messines in 1917, placing 1 million pounds of explosive in 19 separate mines beneath German positions and detonating them simultaneously in one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history to that point. The Australian sapper tradition was not a tradition of building things. It was a tradition of understanding what lay beneath the surface as a professional domain, and of doing with that understanding whatever the situation required. What was not there, and this failure runs beneath every operational choice that followed, was any doctrine for the specific task ahead. Despite the long experience of French forces with the Vietnamese tunnel network, despite the operational history of ARVN sapper units, and despite the limited tunnel entries some American forces had made before the Australians arrived in country, no lessons learned document described what soldiers who entered these tunnels would find or how they should approach the finding of it. The 3 Field Troop sappers were totally unprepared for this role. They would write the manual themselves, in the dark, from first principles. Allied intelligence had been tracking a Viet Cong political military headquarters in the Hobo Woods region for months before January of 1966. The headquarters was believed to be that of the 4th Military Region Command Structure, the organization directing all communist military and political operations against Saigon, Bien Hoa, and the surrounding provinces. The operation designed to destroy it was the largest Allied military operation mounted in South Vietnam to that point. More than 8,000 troops were committed under the overall command of Major General Jonathan Seaman of the United States 1st Infantry Division. The 173rd Airborne Brigade, including one RAR, would insert from the north and west. The Australians, holding the northern flank, were to sweep toward the center of the objective area and drive any Viet Cong forces eastward toward the Saigon River. The timeline was 6 days. The night before the operation, B-52 Stratofortresses flew over the objective area and dropped their loads. 30-ton loads of high explosive falling in patterns that observers at a distance described as turning the jungle into something resembling another planet. Trees shattered and horizontal. Craters pocking the red soil at regular intervals, the green of the canopy replaced by a landscape the color of old blood. Then, on the 7th of January, 1966, Major John Essex Clark, the operations officer of one RAR, conducted an aerial reconnaissance of the planned landing zones and saw what should not have been there. An absence of wildlife movement, ground cover patterns inconsistent with undisturbed jungle, signs that the primary clearing had been prepared by people who expected to fight in it. He recommended the insertion be redirected to landing zone march 3 kilometers away. Lieutenant Colonel Alex Preece, commanding one RAR, agreed. MacGregor later stated that Essex Clark's decision almost certainly saved hundreds of Australian lives. The original zone was, subsequent investigation confirmed, positioned directly above a prepared Viet Cong defensive position. Preece had also concluded, before the operation launched, that the headquarters intelligence was describing was not on the surface. If it was 12 meters underground in laterite clay, the B-52 run that had just destroyed the jungle above it had not touched it. D Company, under Major Ian Fisher, was the first Australian element to make contact. They moved across a cleared zone of flattened jungle toward the position where the intelligence said the enemy headquarters should be. The enemy opened fire from prepared positions in the tree line before D Company had covered half the distance. Lieutenant Jim Bourke was commanding 12 platoon when the first burst came through. A round entered his mouth and exited through his jaw. The wound was catastrophic in the physical sense, and he decided it was not incapacitating in the sense that mattered. He remained on his feet. He continued to give orders. His men watched him do this and made their own assessments of the situation accordingly. 6 men from 12 platoon were wounded in the same engagement. 2 medics who moved forward to treat the casualties were killed. Bourke commanded his platoon until he lost consciousness from blood loss and had to be evacuated. The platoon held its position and did not break. What B Company found on the afternoon of that same day was not enemy fire, but something more disturbing. Moving through their sector, Major Ian McFarlane's men uncovered an underground space that had not appeared in any pre-operation intelligence. It was a hospital. Not a rough field dressing station, but a fully equipped underground medical facility. Transfusion equipment, surgical instruments, medical records, supplies sufficient for a substantial ongoing caseload. The facility had been abandoned within hours. The Viet Cong forces the operation was supposed to fix in place had withdrawn underground before it commenced, taking their personnel and leaving their infrastructure. A hospital underground, command infrastructure underground. The intelligence that had sent 8,000 men into this jungle with a 6-day timeline had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the target. By the end of the 3rd day, 59 weapons had been recovered from surface positions, 20,000 rounds of ammunition, 100 fragmentation grenades, and one 57mm recoilless rifle. 8 2.5-ton trucks were needed to carry the equipment out of the operational area. The numbers looked good on the summary. What the summary would not capture was what 3 field troop had been finding since the 2nd day, working through their sector of the operational area and locating, one by one, the tunnel entrances that Preece's assessment had predicted would be there. Those entrances had been found by that same evening. The mighty mite blowers had pumped tear gas into the shallower sections. The results were inconclusive. The gas went in. Nothing and nobody came out. The question MacGregor had first asked in October was back, and it was bigger, and it was about to be answered by the only method that would actually answer it. MacGregor went first. A sergeant tied a rope around one of his ankles. If he stopped moving and stopped responding to tugs on the rope, they would pull. If pulling did not bring him back, they would know something had gone wrong that pulling would not fix, and they would have to decide what to do about that. MacGregor held his torch in one hand and his service pistol in the other. He was lowered into the tunnel entrance. The sergeant let out the rope. The darkness closed above MacGregor's head, and he began to move forward. Behind him, as he moved, a telephone wire unrolled from a spool. The wire served two purposes. It was a communication line back to the surface, and it was a guide line. In a tunnel that branched, forked, doubled back on itself. The wire was the difference between a route home and the specific variety of disorientation that American soldiers who later entered similar tunnels called the Black Echo. In that enclosed space, the sound of a man's own breathing fills everything. There are no echoes from the walls because the walls are too close to create them. There is the breathing and the darkness and the compass in the pocket and the wire unrolling behind, and whatever is waiting at the next turn that the torch beam has not yet reached. Over 4 days of systematic exploration, MacGregor and his men found what no Allied force had previously mapped and what the B-52 bombardment had left entirely intact. The tunnel network in their sector was not a series of connected passages. It was a multi-level underground installation, 1 level, 2 levels, and in some sections 3 levels deep, dropping from 3 meters to 6 meters to 12 meters below the surface. Individual passages ran for 460 meters before branching. The system widened at certain points into spaces large enough to function as meeting rooms and dormitories, then narrowed again to the connecting passages. At strategic tunnel junctions, the Viet Cong had constructed killing chambers, spaces from which defenders on opposite sides could bring crossfire to bear on anyone entering from either direction. The architecture underground was military architecture in its fullest sense. Command nodes, ambush lanes, interlocking fields of fire. The enemy had not merely gone underground to hide. They had taken their entire doctrine with them. What the Australians recovered from these tunnels over those 4 days was the most significant intelligence yield any Allied unit had produced since the war began. More than 100,000 pages of documents, 90 weapons, radio sets, typewriters, medical equipment, food stores, maps of Allied positions across the region, lists of Viet Cong agents operating throughout South Vietnam, and detailed records of the enemy's political and military command structure throughout Military Region 4. Allied intelligence analysts in Saigon, receiving these materials, used a specific phrase to describe what they were looking at. The first Allied strategic intelligence victory of the war. 3 field troop never heard that phrase applied to what they had done. The phrase went into classified assessments. The men went back to their duties. The comparison that clarifies what the Australians had chosen to do comes from the 11th of January, when soldiers of the American 1st Battalion, 28th Infantry, made their own first contact with the Ku Chi system. Sergeant Stuart Green, specifically noted for his slight build at 130 pounds, accidentally sat down on a concealed trapdoor in the jungle floor. The trapdoor was a tunnel entrance. Green volunteered to go in. He led a squad into the system. They encountered more than 30 Viet Cong fighters in an underground dispensary, and an underground firefight followed. Gas grenades, pistols in the dark, disoriented men fighting their way back to the entrance through a tunnel they had never seen before and had no guide wire to navigate. Green re-entered to retrieve a disoriented comrade and got him out. The Americans withdrew. This was not a failure of courage. It was a different response to the same situation. Tactical rather than methodological, immediate rather than systematic. Both sides did what their instincts and their training pointed to. The distinction between those responses is the distinction that explains why the documents recovered by 3 Field Troop gave Allied intelligence a picture of the enemy's command structure that no other approach to the tunnels produced. The Australians searched. The Americans fought their way out. Only one of those approaches filled trucks with the enemy's secrets. Corporal Robert Boutell was 184 centimeters tall. In any ordinary context, this is not a remarkable fact. It is slightly taller than average, in the way that many men are slightly taller than average, not exceptional, not the kind of physical characteristic that defines a person's life. In the tunnels of the Hobo Woods in January of 1966, it was precisely the fact that mattered above all others. He was a non-commissioned officer, which means he had served long enough to be trusted with responsibility for other men. He had watched his comrades go into the tunnels for 4 days. He had watched them come back, dusty, sometimes shaken, carrying documents and equipment and the particular expression of men who had been underground and found things in the dark that nobody had seen before. On the 4th day, Boutell decided it was his turn. This was not a dramatic decision. It was a professional one. The others had gone. He was part of the troop. He went. The tunnels swallowed him up to his shoulders, and then the physics asserted themselves with complete indifference to his rank, his service record, or his intention. His body blocked the passage of air through the tunnel in the way that a cork blocks a bottle. Not completely, but sufficiently. The Australians had been using the Mighty Mite blower to pump tear gas into tunnel entrances as a preliminary measure before Sappers entered. The gas had done its work in the upper passages. What had not been done, because the technique was still being invented, because there was no manual describing the required flushing procedure, because everything these men were doing was being worked out for the first time in the field, was to adequately clear the residual tear gas and carbon monoxide from the passage before a man entered. Boutell moved forward. The air quality deteriorated. He reached a trap door between 2 underground chambers, wedged in an opening his frame would not pass through, and found himself unable to move in either direction. He removed his respirator in the effort to free himself. The combination of residual tear gas, carbon monoxide, and oxygen depleted to a level. The passage could not replenish around a body of his size, entered his lungs in the quantity and concentration that produces a specific physiological outcome. His comrades above, feeling the rope go slack, began to pull. Several of them went in after him. Each one who entered encountered the same depleted atmosphere and had to be physically dragged back from the entrance before the same outcome that was overtaking Boutell overtook them. In a passage built to exclude his body, Corporal Robert Boutell died on the 12th of January, 1966. The tunnel system had not needed a weapon to kill him. Not a booby trap, not an ambush, not a Viet Cong soldier with a firearm or a blade or any active agency on the part of the enemy. It had needed only its own dimensions, 60 centimeters wide, 75 centimeters high. A passage designed for bodies of approximately 160 centimeters. A man of 184 centimeters who decided it was his turn. The architects of the Q-Chai system had, in designing the passages for Vietnamese physique, built a weapon system whose lethality required no detonation and no trigger. It required only that the wrong body attempt to enter it. The operation did not stop. Above ground, hand-to-hand combat in tunnel junctions continued through the same afternoon. In other sections of the tunnel network, Viet Cong fighters who refused to surrender were entombed when sappers demolished the passage above them, burying 8 men in the clay. The war went on. The technical consequence of Corporal Botel's death was specific and immediate. The gas flushing procedure before tunnel entry was revised. The duration of the flush was extended. Tunnels with residual gas evidence required a longer clearing period before any sapper went in. This is how military doctrine is actually written, not in offices by people who have thought the problem through in advance, but in the field by people who have discovered what happens when the wrong procedure meets the wrong circumstance, and who correct the procedure so that the same thing does not happen to the next man. Corporal Robert Botel was 184 centimeters tall. His height was the fact of his life that his death required. Nothing about that is ordinary at all. Operation Crimp ended on the 14th of January, 1966. Australians, 8 killed, 29 wounded. Americans, 14 killed, 76 wounded. Viet Cong, 128 confirmed killed, an estimated 190 more dead in positions the ground forces could not reach, 92 captured, 509 detained. General Westmoreland visited 1 RAR during the operation. The documents describing the Viet Cong's 4th Military Region command structure were passed to Saigon's intelligence community through the chain of command. Westmoreland's end-of-tour report, filed after the operation concluded, it did not mention Operation Crimp. It did not mention 3 field troop. The specific methodology that had produced those documents, the telephone wire, the compass, the slow, systematic progression through unmapped underground passages, did not appear in any prominent American account of the operation from the period. Westmoreland's institutional response arrived in the weeks that followed. Where standing doctrine had been to seal tunnel entrances, gas them, blow them, and move on, a new directive mandated systematic exploration and exploitation of tunnel systems. A specialist category of soldier was to be trained and designated for this work. They called this new specialist category tunnel rats. The term had been coined by a captain describing his own men as tunnel ferrets. In Australia and Britain, a ferret is a working animal used for centuries to flush prey from burrows, small and quick and entirely at home in the dark. The American journalist at the Saigon press conference had never heard the word used in that sense. He wrote tunnel rats in his notebook and filed his report, and the term entered the record. By the time MacGregor understood what had been written, it had circulated through the American military press far enough to be effectively permanent. The men of 3 Field Troop had invented the role, coined the name, and watched the name attached to a mistranslation of their own description of themselves. The men developed their own assessment of the role and its appropriate measure. Their unofficial motto, adopted by tunnel rats across both Allied armies, was Dog Latin, deliberately pathetic and perfectly calibrated to the spirit of men who had looked at a casualty rate and chosen to be ironical about it. Non gradum anus rodentum. Not worth a rat's ass. The men who had brought the enemy's secrets out of the dark in their own hands measured their own worth in the currency of that joke. MacGregor's Military Cross was awarded later for his leadership and actions across the full deployment. The United States Armed Forces awarded him the Bronze Star separately. 3 Field Troop flew home in September of 1966, and other men came to take their place. When 3 Field Troop returned to Australia, 1 Field Squadron, Royal Australian Engineers, took over the tunnel rat role as part of the 1st Australian Task Force, established at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tui Province. The base occupied a rubber plantation 8 kilometers north of Baria, and it would be home to the Australian force for 5 more years. 1 Field Squadron's 3 troops rotated through Vietnam continuously from 1966 to 1972. Approximately 40 men per troop, each soldier serving a 12-month tour before returning to Australia and being replaced by a new arrival who had not yet learned what the man leaving knew. This was the problem that generated the solution that no institutional process had produced. Because there was no written doctrine for tunnel clearance, the knowledge that kept men alive lived in the men themselves. When a new sapper arrived in country, he was paired with an experienced soldier called a number 1, whose job was to function as his professional guardian for the first 5 to 6 months of the tour. The new man was the number 2. The number 1 passed on what he knew, which tunnel configurations were most likely to be permanently booby-trapped at which points, how to read the temperature and smell of the air before entering, how to move in a way that preserved your options rather than eliminating them. The pairs were designated splinter teams when attached to infantry platoons and mini-teams when operating alongside tanks and armored personnel carriers. Becoming a number 1 yourself, after surviving long enough, learning enough, acquiring the kind of underground knowledge that cannot be transmitted except by experience, came with a formal pay rise. The pay rise was the military's acknowledgement, through the only channel available to it, that what the number 1s knew was worth more than what the number 2s knew, and that the transmission of that knowledge was a function worth formally compensating. The tunnels of Phuoc Tue province were not the architectural giants of the Ku Chi system. They were smaller, simpler, less elaborately constructed. But the darkness was the same, and the uncertainty at each turn was the same, and the calculation about what might be waiting at the point where the torch beam ended was the same calculation every tunnel rat made every time. An infantry platoon conducting a sweep through the jungle near the Longhai Mountains would move for hours through heat that was heavy enough to feel like a physical obstacle, and then find a tunnel entrance, and the radio would call for the sappers, and a splinter team of 2 would arrive. One of them would go down. The entrance might lead nowhere, or it might lead somewhere. The only way to find out was to go in. Understanding what actually killed Australian tunnel rats requires setting aside the image the name carries. Armed Viet Cong waiting in the dark, booby traps in the passages, the specific dangers of underground combat in a confined space. This understanding is not wrong. It is incomplete. Of the approximately 35 Australian sappers who died during the 7-year deployment, 1 was killed by the enemy inside a tunnel. 1. The other 34 died above ground. The mines killed them. Many of those mines had been Australian. In 1967, the engineers of 1 field squadron had laid a defensive barrier minefield, more than 3,000 mines in carefully recorded positions around the Nui Dot perimeter, designed to deny Viet Cong access to the base. The Viet Cong located the mines, lifted them, and reused them. They planted Australian mines in the paths of Australian patrols. They attached Australian mines to improvised triggers that would fire when a sapper reached into the ground to disarm what looked like an emplaced device. The weapon the engineers had installed became the weapon that killed them. The most famous danger of the tunnel rat role was the underground passages. The actual primary danger was the work they did in daylight, in the heat, on the surface of a province where the ground itself had been turned against them. In late June of 1968, a sapper named Bob O'Connor spoke to men who were deciding whether to stay in the role or request a transfer. What he said was not a pep talk. It was an accounting. He told them nobody was going to force them into this kind of work, and that if it was not for them, they should ask for a transfer. But if they decided to stay, he said, they had to believe, and really believe, that they were already dead. Tunnel rat casualty rates were ridiculously high, which made that not too hard to accept. Once you accepted you were a dead man walking, the job got much easier. It even became a challenge. Nothing to do with the army, he said. A personal thing. The acceptance of death as the functional precondition for performing work that might keep you alive. Not fatalism, not despair. Something more practical than either. The removal of the weight of uncertainty that makes every decision heavier than it needs to be. You are already dead. Therefore, you act. The accounting is closed. You can be a soldier now. Approximately 700 men served as tunnel rats in the Australian Engineer Formation across the 7 years of the deployment. 35 died. 200 were wounded. A casualty rate of 1 in 3. In a war where the overall Allied casualty rate was substantially lower than that. Their mottos said everything about how they valued the transaction. They valued themselves at exactly that, and they kept going underground. What MacGregor and his men had been exploring in the Hobo Woods in January of 1966 was not revealed to them in its full significance until after the war was over. When the Vietnamese archives opened and former Viet Cong officers began to speak, the picture emerged. The Tunnel System 3 field troop had entered. The outer corridors they had mapped with telephone wire and compass, the documents they had carried out in their arms and the boots of their trucks, was the command headquarters of the 4th Military Region. The structure directing all communist military and political operations against Saigon, against Bien Hoa, against the provincial capitals of the surrounding region. The Australians had been within meters of the deepest command chambers of the most important military objective in South Vietnam. They had found its outer corridors and recovered the documents that described its function. But the innermost levels, at 12 meters underground, in the hardest clay of the Hobo Woods, had not been fully reached. The operation ended on the 14th of January. The command headquarters survived. None of this was known in January of 1966. The headquarters surviving that operation would still be functioning in January of 1968. On the 30th of January, 1968, Viet Cong forces assembled in the Cu Chi tunnel system launched the most dramatic military operation of the entire Vietnam War. Simultaneous attacks on 36 provincial capitals across South Vietnam, on military installations throughout the country, and on Saigon itself, including a strike on the grounds of the United States Embassy. The Tet Offensive, which shattered American domestic support for the war and began the sequence of events that ended in the American withdrawal, was planned and staged from the tunnel system, whose outer corridors Australian sappers had crawled through 2 years earlier. The tunnel's final act in the war was to serve as the staging base for the assault on Saigon in April of 1975. The command headquarters in the Hobo Woods had survived the B-52 bombardment of January 1966, the subsequent operations, the sustained American air campaign, and partial destruction by delayed fuse bombs in 1969 and 70. It was still operational when North Vietnamese forces entered Saigon on the 30th of April, 1975. 9 years and 3 months after Operation Crimp. The headquarters whose outer tunnels the Australians had been the first to systematically explore outlasted the war that had sent them there. MacGregor returned to Vietnam in 1998. In Ho Chi Minh City, the Australian Consul General arranged 2 meetings. The first was with a man named Tran Buk Dung, the political commissar who had been inside the Cu Chi tunnel system during Operation Crimp and had escaped when the operation concluded. The second was with General Fung, who had commanded the Viet Cong forces at Cu Chi. MacGregor and Tran Buk Dung sat together across a table in a city that had once been Saigon. In January of 1966, they had been on opposite sides of an underground wall in the Hobo Woods, separated by laterite clay that neither of them could see through. Both of them had come back up. MacGregor and General Fung shook hands. The last Australian combat battalion left Nui Dat on the 7th of November, 1971. The last advisors came home in December of 1972. The last engineer convoys out of Phuoc Tuy province drove roads that Australian sappers had built and cleared of mines and maintained for 5 years, in a province where the ground had killed 34 of the 35 tunnel rats who died in the full deployment. Most Australians carry a story about what happened to Vietnam veterans when they came home. Soldiers spat upon, called baby killers, subjected to systematic hostility from a public that had turned against the war. The historian Mark Dapin, researching his book Australia's Vietnam, found that this story does not survive contact with the documentary record. He found no photographs of baby killers' banners at any demonstration. The term did not appear in the Sydney Morning Herald during the war years. The documented confrontations between protesters and returning soldiers across the entire length of the conflict numbered 300,000 people lined the streets of Sydney to welcome home the men of 1 RAR in June of 1966. Welcome home parades occurred throughout the war. The myth of universal hostility obscures the more complicated and, in some ways, more damaging truth. It came from within the profession. The Returned Services League excluded many Vietnam veterans from its clubs during the 1960s and 70s on the grounds that Vietnam had not been a real war. Vietnam veterans were prevented, in many cases, from marching in Anzac Day parades. The RSL was the institutional custodian of the returned serviceman's identity in Australian life. The organization whose membership determined who had earned the right to stand in the march on the 25th of April and who had not. The judgment that what Vietnam veterans had done did not qualify was delivered not by protesters, but by the veterans of the Second World War. From within the same professional tradition the Vietnam veterans had served. To be told, by the men who had defined what real war was, that what you had done in Phuoc Tuy province and the Hobo Woods did not warrant a formal welcome to the Brotherhood was not a political judgment. It was a professional one, from inside the profession, and it left wounds that some men carried longer than the physical ones. The Royal Australian Engineers cannot be awarded battle honours or theatre honours. Their corps designation, UBIC, meaning everywhere, explicitly precludes it. Infantry units, armored units, aviation units that served in Vietnam and performed with distinction are eligible for formal battle honors on their regimental colors that record specific actions in specific theaters. The engineers are not because they did not earn it, because the same institutional framework that acknowledged their presence in every theater denied them the mechanism for recording their presence in any specific one. The sappers who went into the Cu Chi tunnels in January of 1966 will never have a battle honor that says so. UBIC covers everything. UBIC records nothing. The awards picture for the 7-year tunnel rat deployment: 5 military medals and 1 military cross. 6 gallantry awards for approximately 700 men with a casualty rate of 1 in 3. The men were decorated for their courage. They were not decorated commensurately with what they had done. On the 3rd of October, 1987, a national welcome home parade was held in Sydney. An estimated 100,000 people attended. Prime Minister Bob Hawke was present. The parade was organized on the widely shared assumption that no such event had occurred during the war itself, that soldiers had come home in the dark without ceremony. That assumption was factually wrong. Large parades had occurred throughout the war, but the 1987 parade was the first time the Australian nation formally and publicly acknowledged, as a nation, that what these men had done was worth that acknowledgement. The sappers who had been underground in the Hobo Woods in January of 1966 were in their early 40s by October of 1987. Some of them were not alive to march. The tunnel was 60 centimeters wide and 75 centimeters high. The Americans looked at that entrance, reached for the gas canister and the demolition charge, and sealed what they found. The Australians sent in a man with a rope around his leg and a torch in one hand and a pistol in the other. And the man they sent in went forward into the dark and wrote in telephone wire and compass readings the first map that anyone on the Allied side had made of the underground world the Viet Cong had built beneath South Vietnam. The distance between the name those men gave to their role and the soldiers that name attaches to in history. Tunnel Rats, an American journalist's mistranslation of an Australian captain's description of his own soldiers, is the distance in which the real story of Australia's war in Vietnam is written. The doctrine they created bore another nation's designation. The headquarters they partially explored staged the battle that broke American will for the war. The parade that finally acknowledged them arrived 15 years after the last of them came home. Sandy MacGregor came back from Vietnam in September of 1966 with a military cross and a Bronze Star, and the knowledge of what it felt like to be lowered into the ground on the end of a rope in the dark. He served for 30 years. He married twice and had 6 children. On the 23rd of January, 1987, 21 years after Operation Crimp, 3 of his daughters were murdered at their home in Sydney. He said in the years that followed that he had concluded that hatred and anger would only make him another victim. In 2001, he met the man who had killed his daughters in prison and forgave him face to face. A man who had spent 4 days going forward into unmapped darkness toward whatever was waiting there had 21 years later to make the same kind of decision again. He made it the same way. Tunnel Rats, coined by an Australian, misheard by an American. The most famous 2 words the Vietnam War produced about the men who fought it underground. Still used, still attached primarily, in most of the world's memory, to soldiers who learned the method from men whose names they almost certainly never knew. If you believe those men deserve to be remembered, leave a comment below. And if you want to understand what the soldiers of the Vietnam War carried home with them, watch this next.